Hello, so today we're going to be talking about the disadvantage, which is a negative argument that you can use in Lincoln-Douglas debate. It generally actually comes from policy debate, but it's still useful in this format, and I think it's really important to understand the parts because generally, if you know all the parts, you're actually going to be making better arguments. Most people are going to be using disadvantages when they first start debating, but they don't know all the parts, and they're going to be missing things within their arguments, and as a result, their arguments are going to be a lot weaker. So we'll go through and make sure we know all the points, and you can better debate during your negative rounds. Before we go into these, I would like to say that this is not my own work. It actually comes from 3 national champions, which is why I always get super excited about this lecture, because it was taught to me by the best. But it comes from Bennett Eckert, Anna Meyer, and I'm going to pronounce his last name wrong, and I'm going to feel bad, but it's Vishon Chaudhry, I want to say. Definitely wrong, but I try. But I would just like to thank them. Like I said, they're all national champions and they're all great guys. So I definitely appreciate them letting me use the slideshow. So let's go and look at what a disadvantage actually is first. And it's simply the reason why the affirmative side is bad. So obviously, as the negative side, we want to be saying that we shouldn't be voting for the affirmative. And whenever we are having a disadvantage, the main way we're going to be trying to reach that conclusion is that the affirmative side is going to be producing some negative consequence for society, and that it's going to outweigh all positive consequences they can bring about. So there are 4 parts of a disadvantage. We have uniqueness, link, internal link, and impact. So we're going to go part by part and explain what they mean, and then we're going to provide examples for them. So first we're going to be using this analogy called dis-add-dan, and hopefully it works well. Most of the time you're supposed to draw it out, but in this format I unfortunately can't really do that. So we're just going to be trying to verbally explain it. And then we're also going to be providing an example about taxes, going back to the argument that has been used on the current topic, which is resolve the United States ought to provide a federal jobs guarantee. So just for like basic background information, the argument itself is simply saying that if we provide the federal jobs guarantee, the government is going to have to raise taxes to pay for it. So without further ado, let's look at these points. So the first is uniqueness. And the basic idea behind uniqueness is it's describing what is happening right now in the current world. Obviously, as the negative side, unless you have a counter plan, which we'll talk about later in a different video. But if you don't have a counter plan, then you're arguing that what is happening right now in the world is good enough. So your uniqueness, which is obviously trying to address what is happening right now, you're going to say that it's going great right now. Because if you're saying it's bad, that'd be reasons to vote for the affirmative, obviously. So that's a pretty simple concept. You want to say that things are going okay right now. But whenever we have this, we want to make sure that we say that it's not too good. Because whenever we argue that things are going amazing for society, that's going to make it unbelievable that we can see things turn and be awful in just a short amount of time. So that's a bit of a weird concept. Let's provide the stock market as an example. Let's say that for my argument, I'm trying to say that we're going to see a stock market crash if the affirmative side does what they're going to do. So for my uniqueness, I say that the stock market right now is doing great. In fact, I say that the stock market is like reaching record highs. It's never been this good before. Well, if we look back at what my end goal is, which is to say that the affirmative side is going to make the stock market crash, it starts to become a little unbelievable, right? Like, what the affirmative is going to do, such as like providing a federal jobs guarantee, is going to cause such a drastic change in the stock market that we're going to go from all-time highs to all-time lows. That's not really believable. So we need to make sure that we say that things are going good right now, but not too good. So we'll say the stock market's holding steady. Things are fine. And then that's believable. If someone said that providing a federal jobs guarantee would cost so much it's going to harm the stock market and can cause a crash, that's believable. So that's why you want to have that idea of brink uniqueness. So connecting this back to dis-add-dan, let's first explain what dis-add-dan is. So a man is standing at the edge of a cliff. His name is Dan. Someone is going to come along and push Dan, and he's going to fall to the bottom of the cliff and die. A very simple scenario. But everything that happens in that fraction of a second, but in a couple seconds is going to be a way that we can help explain the disadvantage. So First, let's look at uniqueness. Remember, it's the description of what is happening right now. So in this case, it would simply be Dan is standing at the edge of a cliff. Nothing's really going on. He's just standing there. Whenever we look at brink uniqueness, we want to make sure that he is standing at the edge of the cliff. If we have him standing way far from the edge of the cliff, then he's not going to fall over the edge no matter what. But if he's standing at the edge, there is a threat that he could feasibly fall off the edge if something happens. So let's first let's move into the actual example that we're providing for this taxes example. So the argument here is that obviously taxes are going to increase, and we need to say that things are going fine right now. So we'll say that taxes are somewhat low. We don't want to say that they're super incredibly low and people are barely paying anything, because obviously that would harm our brink uniqueness, but we'll say that they're pretty reasonable, like generally what taxes have been for like most of history, like obviously like taking into account inflation and stuff, but like people are paying about the same percentage of their paycheck, and that's fine. Pretty reasonable levels. That would be our uniqueness for that argument. So next, let's move on to the link. This is going to be how the affirmative side actually changes what is happening right now. And obviously, since you are on the negative side and you're trying to say that the affirmative is bad, you're going to be saying that they're changing the status quo in a bad way. They thought it was important to make note that it's a really bad way, obviously. So bringing this to decide Dan, this is going to be the affirmative side is coming and they're going to push Dan over the edge of the cliff. Obviously, that is going to lead to some bad things, which we'll get to later. But that's what the link is. It's as simple as that. Putting it in a more concrete example that actually relates to LD, whenever we talk about pushing them over the metaphorical cliff in the taxes example, this is going to be that the government is going to need money to pay for the federal jobs guarantee to give to their citizens. Notice how we didn't jump to taxes right here. There's a reason behind that. And that's because the link isn't the last step, because if you remember, we also have the internal link, which is simply another link. You can have as many of these as you want, or them not at all. It just depends on how many steps you need to take to get to the end goal that you're talking about. So whenever we use the example of taxes, we might be able to get there in one piece of evidence that simply gives one explanation that says having the federal jobs guarantee will increase taxes. But there might be a couple steps that we need to take to get there. So giving this to the disadd Dan example, we can see that simply pushing Dan off the cliff, there's something else that is at play that is making it to where Dan is actually going to get hurt, and it's gravity. You know, if we didn't have gravity and we just pushed Dan over the edge of the cliff and he's just going to float there, nothing bad is going to happen. We need this extra piece to actually make sure that something is going to happen. Notice that gravity is only playing an actual role in him falling off the cliff because he was already pushed. That is important for internal links. They need to come as like a chain reaction from the first action that you take. So obviously, once we push him off the edge, gravity is going to pull him to the bottom of the cliff and move us to our impact. Before we move on to that impact, though, let's bring it back to our taxes example. So we already left off where we're saying that the government is going to need money to pay for the federal jobs guarantee, which then brings us to the point that to pay for that jobs guarantee and to get that money, they're going to raise taxes. We have finally gotten to our main argument. Now, if we needed several cards to get to that point about how they're going to raise taxes, that's fine. We'll have more internal links. In this case, we only needed one link and one internal link, so it was a rather simple one, but it could get as complicated as it needs to, as long as it's not like too complicated for your judge to understand and it's not wasting your time. So now let's move on to the impact. There's a nice little Office reference there, but the impact is obviously just the bad thing that is going to happen. It's going to be the reason why at the heart that we shouldn't be voting for the affirmative side. So for disadd Dan, it's going to be him hitting the bottom of the cliff and dying. That's what the negative side is going to be arguing, is that the affirmative side is killing Dan for these reasons. So bringing this to the taxes example, the taxes itself aren't inherently bad, right? Like, people might view it that way, but the raise in taxes isn't what's actually hurting people. It's the fact that now they have less money to pay for themselves as a result of the taxes. Thus, the actual impact is poverty, which is something that you want to make clear for your judge. Whenever people talk about impact, a term that I always like to use is, why should I care? Because that's truly what it's saying. you can come up to me and tell me that taxes are going to increase or the stock market's going to crash or all these different things. But until you actually tell me why it should matter to me as an individual, then I really don't have any reason to vote for your side, which would be a shame if you built a super nice disadvantage but just simply couldn't get an impact in there and now all your hard work goes to waste. That's why I think the impact is one of the most important parts. Because for the other parts, I can help poke holes in what you say. Sure, if you forget to put uniqueness, that's going to result in the other side coming in and saying that, oh, it's not that big of an issue, which we'll get into later. But without an impact, the issue actually comes with your judge, and they won't care. So that's why it's important to have this. So now let's move on to answering disadvantages. If you have those parts in there and they're all sufficient and your evidence is good, you can actually dodge a lot of these responses, which is great. But it's whenever these, like your uniqueness starts to be a little link and they don't meet all the requirements when we can start seeing these answers to disadvantages. So let's go to what you should do when you are responding to a disadvantage and you're on the affirmative side. So first, looking at uniqueness, there are two main arguments you can use to attack this. The first is going to be simply saying that the situation is completely non-unique and that the status quo is already bad. So this would be with our disad Dan argument, that Dan is already falling off the cliff. Like, the affirmative side can't come and push him off because things are already bad. In our taxes example, this would be saying that taxes are already increasing. So what the affirmative side isn't really going to matter, because no matter what we do, things are already going bad anyway. So we might as well produce my action that also has these other good consequences, because neither side is going to prevent taxes from increasing or prevent Dan from dying. There's nothing we can do, so might as well not bring it into the debate. It's a moot point. We also have uniqueness overwhelms the link, which is less strong, but it's still okay, which is this argument. It goes back to our break uniqueness. So it's saying essentially that things are so good right now that it's unfeasible that things can go bad. We already talked about that one a lot, so I really don't feel like we need to talk about it too much. I'm sure you guys got this one. Next, moving on to the link. This one isn't bad at all either. There are a couple of different arguments that we can use here. There's really only three at heart, and the thumpers kind of aren't great, but we'll get there. So the first is going to be a link term, which is the way that the affirmative actually helps reduce the issue. So this would be saying that we're going to be pushing Dan away from the edge of the cliff. Or it could be, bringing it back to our taxes example, saying that we're going to reduce taxes. There's really not a whole lot more to say there. That's all that you're really going to say, is that I don't actually make the issue worse, I make it better. We also have link defense, which is not as a strong version of the link turn. There's two different types of it. So instead of saying that we're going to make the situation better, we're simply going to say that we don't make it as bad. So let's say that we do push Dan forward a little bit, but he just kind of stumbles forward and he doesn't fall off the cliff. He's a little closer to the edge, but he's still not falling, and he's not going to die, so it's things aren't really bad, right? We also have terminal link defense, which is whenever you say you don't make things worse at all. We don't push Dan. He just is going to sit there and stand, and nothing is actually going to change about his situation. Obviously, these would both be reasons to vote for the affirmative side still, though, because we're saying that the issue isn't actually going to happen, so it's kind of just a moot point, and we shouldn't really address it. So, thumpers are a little odd. You don't see them a whole lot, but it's this idea that the link has already happened. So it's Dan has already been pushed. Taxes have already been raised in the past, and we don't actually see any negative thing happening. Whenever these things happen, it doesn't actually harm society. The impact doesn't really match up. This one I definitely don't see as much. I do sometimes. In fact, for our taxes example, it's one that we've seen used because some people have said, well, taxes may increase, but in the past, people have just been able to deal with that without these giant jumps in poverty. So it's not the worst argument ever, but it's definitely probably my least favorite out of all of the parts of this slideshow. We do have a quick aside here about our link turns offense. You might think that it is because whenever we think of the word turn, we automatically think of offense, but actually it's not at all, due to the fact that we're not actually producing a benefit. So whenever you think about pushing Dan away from the edge of the cliff, we're not actually doing anything to make Dan's life better. Whether or not he's standing at the edge or a bit farther away doesn't really change his situation. So since we're not doing anything to better his life, that's no reason to vote for the affirmative side. However, we can do a small change to make it to where we are going to be giving a reason to vote for the affirmative side. And that's by combining a non-unique argument with a link turn. So remember, whenever we say non-unique, we say that Dan is already falling off the edge of the cliff. And with a link turn, we're saying that we're going to be pushing him further on the cliff. So if you combine these two, then you're saying that the bad thing is already happening, but we actually prevent it. Dan is already falling, but we grab his hand and we pull him back onto that cliff. This is a reason to vote for the affirmative side because you're preventing a negative thing. You're preventing Dan from hitting that ground and dying. This would be the equivalent of saying that taxes are increasing right now, and if we don't do anything, people are going to go into poverty, but the affirmative side actually reduces taxes and prevents that impact. That's why the straight turn is actually a reason to vote for the affirmative side and is the best argument you can make against a disadvantage, by far. Now, let's go on to impacts. This should be our last little bit for this slideshow. So we have a couple different arguments. Once again, we have impact defense, which is saying that the bad thing is not actually that bad. The impact that we're having isn't going to harm our society that much. So for Dan, this would be him hitting the ground and breaking his leg, or maybe he hits the ground and there's a mattress down there and he doesn't get harmed at all. Nothing good is happening, like he's just at the bottom of the cliff now, and also he might sustain minor damages like we said with the leg, but he's not going to be dying like the negative side made it out to be, so it's not as bad. We also have an impact turn, which is saying that we actually are going to be seeing things are made better, and that the supposed impact of him hitting the ground is a good thing. So this would be the equivalent of Dan going to the bottom of the cliff and then he finds there's a bunch of money down there. We've actively made Dan's life better by pushing him over the edge of the cliff. Now, impact turns are super great, but they're really hard to use sometimes. So let's actually look towards our example where we talk about the impact as poverty is going to increase. An impact turn would say that increasing poverty is a good thing, but I don't know how you'd make that argument. And I feel like that's something that is common with a lot of impact turns, because we can also see that whenever we talk about people dying, it's how do you say that people dying is a good thing? Or the affirmative side says or negative side says that the affirmative increases oppression, and then you have to say that oppression is a good thing. And it's most of the time link turns or impact turns are not super strong, because arguing that these impacts are good are a stretch to say the least. So that's why they're a little out there, but if you can make them work, they're good. You do, in order to have that impact turn, though, need to have impact defense. So let's look at Dan one last time and try and combine these two arguments. If Dan hits the cliff, or at the bottom of the cliff, and he dies, it doesn't matter if the money is down there. His life is still bad because he's dead. We can't have this impact turn without having the impact defense. So we need to make sure that we have the little mattress down there to save his life, or that he's only going to break his leg or whatever, because otherwise the impact turn doesn't actually work, which just goes to show that you first need to mitigate the harms of the impact before you can actually try and turn it and say it's a good thing. You can't have the impact turn without the impact defense, but you can have impact defense without an impact turn. So, but anyway, that's all we got here. I know that was a lot of information, definitely kind of thrown down your throat very quickly. But like I said, it's just important to understand all these basic different ideas and how you can apply them in LD rounds to make your cases and your rebuttals stronger. It's important that you don't use any of these terms in your debate rounds unless you debate on the national circuit, because your judge isn't going to know what uniqueness is, neither is your opponent, honestly, probably, or such as break uniqueness or even internal links or all these different things. They're not going to know what they mean. So it's important that you don't use the word uniqueness, but understanding the concept can make sure that you're actually able to better produce these ideas and better make your cases. So that's why I think it's important to know these. But otherwise, there's not too much more to know about disadvantages. And if you can get all these into your case and all of these into your rebuttals, then you'll be a better debater for it. But on that note, I hope this video was educational. I hope that Dan was able to help you even without the drawings. And as always, I wish you guys luck in all.